The air in Buckingham Palace was heavier than usual that afternoon, a tense, almost suffocating silence that seemed to press down on every ornate corridor and gilded room. The sunlight, streaming through the massive windows of the throne room, fell across the polished marble floors, reflecting off crystal chandeliers in sharp, blinding glints. On the surface, it was a perfect, pristine afternoon, like any other in the life of Britain's royal family. But beneath the polished veneer, a storm was brewing. A storm that would not only rock the foundations of the palace, but challenge the very bonds of family loyalty. Have you ever imagined walking into a room, knowing that everything you say might be recorded, scrutinized, and weaponized against you? Prince Harry did. And on that day, he wasn't just walking into any room. He was stepping into a high-stakes meeting with his older brother, Prince William, and their father, King Charles. A private, closed-door conversation that, in theory, should have been governed by trust and shared blood. But trust, it seemed, was a fragile thing. And in this palace, fragile things had a tendency to shatter spectacularly. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story begins, as all great dramas do, with a secret. Not just any secret, but one that could topple reputations, inflame old rivalries, and expose the most intimate conflicts of a family always under the world's microscope. Harry, increasingly frustrated by whispers of palace politics, the constant media scrutiny, and the pressures of royal expectation, made a decision that would change everything. He decided to secretly record the meeting. Hidden among his belongings was a small device, almost unnoticeable, capable of capturing every word, every hesitation, every subtle inflection. It was meant to be a safeguard, a silent witness to the conversation that he feared might otherwise be twisted or misrepresented. But what does it mean to record your own family in secret? For some, it would be a betrayal. For others, it would be a necessary measure in the game of survival and power. And for Harry, it was both, a desperate, cautious act that balanced on the knife edge of morality and necessity. The palace had always been a place where appearances mattered above all else, where smiles could mask suspicion and polite nods could conceal seething resentment. But when a hidden recording device enters the equation, appearances can no longer protect anyone. Imagine standing there, heart racing, palms slightly damp, aware that your brother, your own flesh and blood, is already bracing himself for confrontation. William had been expecting this meeting, though he did not know about the recording. What he did know, perhaps instinctively, was that something was off. There was a tension in the air, a subtle shift in tone that made even seasoned palace staff glance nervously over their shoulders. And then, as Harry entered the room, the dance began. William's gaze, sharp and measured, scanned his younger brother. "Harry," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the room seem smaller, heavier. "We need to talk." Those three words were deceptively simple. In the world of royalty, a simple statement could carry a multitude of threats, warnings, and implications. Every word, every gesture, was magnified by history, expectation, and the ever-present gaze of the public. And in this room, with the king silently observing, every movement was scrutinized, every pause weighted with meaning. What was William thinking at that moment? Was it anger, disappointment, or a calculated attempt to assert dominance? The dynamics of power within a family are complicated enough under ordinary circumstances. But when you're dealing with heirs to a monarchy, every expression is a potential statement of intent, and every reaction is interpreted not just by family, but by a global audience. As the conversation began, subtle jabs were exchanged, carefully veiled comments that could be brushed off as casual observations, but were anything but casual. The tension was almost tangible, electric, and Harry, aware of the device tucked away in his pocket, felt a strange mixture of anxiety and vindication. Every word spoken could serve as both shield and weapon. But the device was more than just a recording tool. It was a silent testament to the truth as Harry perceived it. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Harry, William was not just reacting. He was strategizing. The eldest brother has always been seen as a figure of composure, of control, someone who could navigate crises with a steady hand. But there is a difference between controlling the public image of a monarchy and controlling the private dynamics of your own family. And on this day, William was confronted with a reality that no amount of rehearsed etiquette could fully prepare him for. His brother was recording him. Have you ever considered how power shifts in a room the moment one party gains leverage over another? In this instance, the leverage was invisible, hidden in a device small enough to be held in a hand, yet powerful enough to capture every nuance of the interaction. Harry, in his own way, was asserting agency, taking control in a situation where he had long felt marginalized, misrepresented, and silenced. But William, like any master strategist, was not about to concede the field. What happened next is a sequence of events so charged with emotion, so loaded with drama, that it could only unfold in a palace where history and modernity collide. Words were exchanged, some sharp and accusatory, others measured and diplomatic. Emotions ran high: pride, frustration, betrayal, and a lingering sadness that comes when family bonds are tested under impossible circumstances. And all the while, the hidden recording device bore silent witness to every moment. Outside the room, the palace carried on its usual rhythm. Staff moved through corridors, unaware of the storm raging behind closed doors. But the consequences of that meeting would ripple far beyond those gilded walls. When whispers began to leak, rumors of confrontation, hints of betrayal, the public would be captivated, divided, and eager for every detail. Social media would erupt, headlines would scream, and once private family dynamics would become a global spectacle. And yet, even as the world waited for answers, one question remained. What exactly did Harry capture on that device? What truths, grievances, or confessions were now preserved, hidden from view but potent with the power to disrupt, to provoke, to change the narrative forever? The anticipation of revelation is almost unbearable because the content of those recordings could validate suspicions, upend alliances, and redefine the public's perception of the royal family. But what made this confrontation even more explosive was William's reaction. When the realization of the secret recording dawned on him, it was not merely a question of etiquette or family decorum. It was a challenge to his authority, a crack in the carefully curated image of control he had worked so hard to maintain. And how one reacts when their authority is questioned, especially in the presence of both a sibling and a king, can determine the trajectory of personal relationships and public perception alike. The air grew thick with tension, every pause stretched longer than it should have, every glance charged with meaning. And then, in a moment that would become the turning point of the encounter, William made a decision, one that would shock not only Harry but the palace staff, the royal advisors, and eventually, the world. A decision that would redefine boundaries, test loyalties, and set the stage for a confrontation that no one could have predicted. At that moment, the recording was no longer just a passive observer. It had become an instrument, a silent arbiter that could amplify truths, distort perceptions, and reveal vulnerabilities. Harry, fully aware of the gravity of his actions, knew that this meeting could change everything. And William, in his measured yet resolute manner, understood that the outcome of this private encounter could have repercussions far beyond the palace walls. By the time the meeting concluded, even the most seasoned palace aides sensed the seismic shift that had occurred. Subtle but undeniable, the dynamics between the brothers had changed, the balance of power temporarily unsettled, and the stage set for events that would dominate headlines and social discourse for months, possibly years. But what exactly happened next? How did William respond to this breach of trust? And what did Harry do when confronted with his brother's ultimatum? The answers lie in the sequence of events that followed, each more dramatic than the last, each capable of rewriting the narrative of loyalty, betrayal, and family in the royal household. And just as the palace doors closed behind them, the world outside remained blissfully unaware, waiting for the revelation that would inevitably explode into public consciousness. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Introduction complete at just over 2,000 words. The story begins not in the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, but in the quieter corners of Montecito, California, where Prince Harry had spent the last several years trying to carve out a life away from relentless media scrutiny. He had traded ceremonial duties for independence, public appearances for private reflection, and in doing so, had discovered a world where his every move wasn't dissected by the press. But even thousands of miles away, the weight of the monarchy never fully lifted. Family dynamics, palace politics, and long-simmering tensions remained, lurking in the background, sometimes erupting without warning. Harry's decision to secretly record the meeting with his brother and father didn't come lightly. It wasn't born from a desire to spy or manipulate. It was, in his mind, a defensive measure. For years, he had felt misunderstood, often misrepresented by insiders and tabloids alike. Every interview, every public statement, seemed to confirm that the narratives spun around him were beyond his control. And for someone who had devoted a lifetime to serving and honoring his family name, this constant misrepresentation stung in ways few could truly understand. Have you ever felt compelled to document something, just to make sure the truth isn't lost or twisted? For Harry, the recording device wasn't just a tool, it was a shield, a safeguard against misinterpretation, and a way to ensure that, should the worst happen, he would have his own account. Every word spoken, every pause, every subtle inflection could be captured, analyzed, and preserved. It was a silent witness to what he anticipated could be a moment of confrontation, perhaps even betrayal. Setting up the device required careful planning. Harry wasn't just walking into a room and hoping for the best. He orchestrated the meeting with precision, ensuring that he could remain as inconspicuous as possible. The device was small, almost invisible, capable of recording for hours without drawing attention. And yet, despite the technological simplicity, the act of bringing it into a palace where every inch is monitored and every guest is accounted for was a risk. A single misstep could mean humiliation, scandal, or worse, damage to relationships that were already strained. But why would Harry go to such lengths? The answer lies in the history between the brothers. Harry and William had once shared a bond forged in childhood, strengthened by shared experiences and mutual understanding. But as the years progressed, differences emerged, differences in personality, public approach, and expectations of duty. William, ever the heir apparent, had assumed a role that demanded composure, strategy, and control. Harry, in contrast, sought authenticity, emotional openness, and independence. These divergent paths, while not unusual in families, became amplified under the intense glare of public scrutiny. The recording wasn't just a precaution, it was a statement. By secretly documenting the meeting, Harry was asserting his agency in a situation where he had long felt powerless. The palace, with its strict hierarchies and rigid protocols, often left him on the margins. Public statements and carefully choreographed appearances could not convey the nuances of his feelings, nor could they fully communicate the complexities of his relationships. The recording, in his eyes, was a way to reclaim some measure of control, to have a voice that could not be silenced or misrepresented. On the morning of the meeting, Harry's routine was meticulous. He reviewed what he wanted to say, anticipated potential questions, and rehearsed responses to possible challenges. Every detail mattered: the timing of his entrance, the positioning of the recording device, the tone of his voice. He knew that once he stepped into the palace, there would be no turning back. The environment was charged with history, symbolism, and expectation, and he needed to navigate it with both caution and courage. The device itself was a marvel of modern technology, small, discreet, and capable of capturing audio with remarkable clarity. Yet, beyond the technical aspect, it symbolized a broader struggle. It represented the tension between tradition and modernity, between privacy and transparency, between loyalty and self-preservation. For Harry, the act of recording was both practical and symbolic. It was a way to ensure the integrity of the conversation, and at the same time, it was a quiet rebellion against a system that had often felt suffocating. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to confront family while knowing that everything you say is being captured? That every word, every hesitation, could be scrutinized, dissected, and judged? For Harry, that was the reality. The stakes were incredibly high, not just for his personal relationships, but for his public image and, ultimately, for the monarchy itself. The lines between private family matters and public spectacle were blurred, and navigating that space required both courage and calculation. As the meeting approached, Harry reflected on the dynamics he had observed over the years. He remembered past conversations with William, moments of connection and tension, times when words had been left unsaid and feelings had been buried. He thought about his father, King Charles, and the complex relationship that had evolved over decades, an intricate mix of expectation, duty, and unspoken love. These reflections added layers of emotional weight to the meeting. He knew that the recording would capture not just words, but the underlying currents of emotion, frustration, disappointment, vulnerability, and perhaps even regret. And then came the moment of entry. Stepping into Buckingham Palace was like stepping onto a stage, the audience unseen but palpably present. Every movement, every gesture was magnified. Harry felt the weight of history, the gaze of tradition, and the unspoken expectations of royalty pressing down on him. Yet, beneath the surface, a quiet determination guided him. He had prepared, he had planned, and he was ready to face the consequences. The initial exchange was deceptively calm. Polite greetings, measured smiles, the formalities of royal protocol. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Harry felt the subtle shifts in posture, the quick glances exchanged between William and Charles, the slight inflections in tone that suggested anticipation, caution, and perhaps suspicion. Every second in that room heightened the drama, and every word spoken carried implications far beyond the immediate conversation. What exactly was Harry hoping to achieve with this recording? Was it to hold William accountable, to ensure his own narrative was preserved, or to protect himself from potential misrepresentation? The answer is all of the above and more. In the complex world of royal family dynamics, where every gesture can be interpreted as a statement, and every statement can be amplified, having a documented record was both a safeguard and a weapon. And yet, there was a lingering question. Would the recording actually protect him, or would it inflame tensions further? The act of documenting a private family discussion was unprecedented, and it carried the risk of being perceived as betrayal. Harry was aware of the delicate balance he was navigating, between honesty and strategy, between protection and provocation, between familial loyalty and self-preservation. By the time the conversation began in earnest, the stage was set for a confrontation that would ripple through the palace and beyond. The recording device, silent and unassuming, was poised to capture every detail, every nuance, every emotional spike. Harry was ready to speak, ready to defend, and ready to confront the realities of a family under pressure. But as the meeting unfolded, it became clear that this was not just a simple recording. It was a catalyst. The device, the conversation, and the underlying emotions combined to create a volatile mix. And in that volatility lay the seeds of an event that would challenge perceptions, redefine relationships, and set the stage for a dramatic fallout that no one could have predicted. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Every word spoken, every pause, every glance carried weight. And then, in a moment of quiet but seismic significance, William made the first move, not in words, but in intention. The balance of power, already delicate, began to shift. Harry, unaware of the full scope of his brother's plan, continued to speak, the device capturing each carefully chosen word, each emotion-laden pause. But what Harry didn't know was that the recording would trigger a response far more dramatic than he anticipated. A response that would not only impact his relationship with William and Charles, but also reverberate throughout the palace and beyond, touching the lives of those who would never even step foot in the royal corridors. The events set in motion by this secret recording were about to redefine loyalty, power, and trust in ways that no one could have foreseen. And just when Harry thought he had control over the narrative, just when he believed that the recording would safeguard him, William took an action that would turn the meeting upside down, and what happened next would change everything. The atmosphere in Buckingham Palace shifted instantly. What had begun as a carefully choreographed, controlled meeting between two brothers and their father now teetered on the edge of chaos. Harry, though prepared and guarded, felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation of being caught in a storm he hadn't fully anticipated. William, meanwhile, exuded a quiet but undeniable authority. Every movement, every glance, every syllable seemed calculated, as if he were orchestrating a symphony only he could hear. The tension wasn't just about words, it was about power. William had long been the heir apparent, the one groomed to embody the monarchy's public face, the one expected to maintain dignity, control, and composure no matter what. Harry, by contrast, had pursued independence, authenticity, and emotional honesty, qualities that were often seen as vulnerabilities in the rigid, hierarchical world of royalty. The friction between duty and individuality, tradition and rebellion, loyalty and autonomy had been simmering for years. Now it was boiling over in real time. William leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto Harry. There was a weight in his eyes, a mixture of disappointment and authority. "Harry, you know why we called you here," he said, his voice calm but edged with tension. "We need to discuss your recent actions. This recording, for example." Harry's pulse quickened. He had anticipated that this topic would come up, but hearing it addressed so directly and so publicly within the confines of the palace felt different. It wasn't just a private disagreement anymore. It was a confrontation with stakes that could redefine their relationship forever. "William, it's not what you think," Harry replied, his voice steady but firm. "I recorded this meeting because I needed a clear account of what's being said. Too often, things are taken out of context or misrepresented. I can't afford to be misunderstood again." The words hung in the air like a challenge. William's expression didn't waver, but a subtle tension in his jaw betrayed his inner conflict. He had always been the strategic one, the planner, the one who considered public perception above all else. Harry, on the other hand, had never shied away from expressing raw emotion, from challenging norms, from speaking truth, even when it made others uncomfortable. King Charles, seated between them, remained silent for the moment, observing. The king had always been a figure of authority and diplomacy, but the strain between his sons was testing even his patience. He could sense the unspoken history, the arguments left unresolved, the past resentments, the divergent paths each had taken. This wasn't just a meeting. It was the collision of years of tension, emotion, and expectation. "You don't understand," William said finally, his voice firmer now. "Recording a private meeting? That's not how we handle family matters. That's not how we handle the monarchy. You've crossed a line, Harry." Harry felt a surge of frustration. Wasn't this exactly the kind of honesty he had always tried to bring to the family? Wasn't this transparency supposed to foster understanding rather than conflict? But the palace had rules, unwritten, strict, and often unforgiving, and William was the guardian of those rules. "Crossed a line?" Harry asked, his voice rising slightly. "Do you know what it feels like to have your words twisted, to have your intentions misrepresented, to have your entire character dissected by people who don't even know you? I did this to protect myself, to make sure the truth is recorded." The air crackled with intensity. Every word, every pause, every shift in posture amplified the tension. William's eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of anger passing through them before he masked it with a controlled sigh. "This isn't about public perception, Harry. This is about family, and you're making it a spectacle." The word spectacle struck a nerve. Harry had spent years being scrutinized, criticized, and misunderstood. Every move he made was public property, every statement dissected and analyzed. And now, even within the privacy of the palace, he felt that same judgment, that same lack of understanding. King Charles finally spoke, his voice calm but weighted with authority. "Both of you need to remember why we are here. This isn't about blame. It's about understanding. But Harry, I need to know why you felt the need to record this meeting without informing anyone. That's serious." Harry took a deep breath, feeling the emotional spike of vulnerability that always accompanied discussions with his father. "I didn't inform anyone because I knew it would be seen as betrayal. But I needed this, for clarity, for accountability, and for my own protection. I'm not doing this to undermine anyone. I'm doing this to ensure the truth is preserved." There was a brief, heavy silence. William's gaze was unwavering, his lips pressed in a thin line. He seemed to be weighing every possible reaction, every potential consequence. Harry, on the other hand, felt a surge of adrenaline. The stakes had never been higher, and yet he couldn't back down. "Not now, not here." Then, without warning, William stood up. The movement was sudden, precise, and deliberate, a physical assertion of authority. "Harry, I think it's clear we're not on the same page. Maybe you need to leave." The words landed like a thunderclap. Harry's stomach dropped. "Leave?" He had walked into this meeting prepared for confrontation, for tension, for discussion, but being told to leave by his own brother in the middle of Buckingham Palace was a different level of shock. Leave? Harry echoed, his voice tight with disbelief. You can't be serious. This is supposed to be a conversation about understanding, not exile. William's eyes hardened. I am serious. You've undermined the trust of this family. You've brought a recording device into a private meeting. That's not just disrespectful, it's a violation. I can't allow this to continue. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in with the weight of history, expectation, and betrayal. Harry's mind raced. He had anticipated tension, but not this direct confrontation, not this public humiliation. And yet, even as the shock settled, a spark of defiance ignited within him. He knew he couldn't leave without defending himself, without asserting his truth. I'm not leaving, Harry said firmly, his voice resonating with determination. Not until this conversation is finished. You want to talk about trust? Let's talk about honesty, accountability, and the fact that for years, I've been misunderstood, judged, and silenced. William's jaw tightened. The king's expression was one of concern and exasperation. The tension in the room was now palpable. Every word, every glance, every subtle gesture loaded with unspoken history. And then came the twist that no one expected. Harry, in an effort to assert transparency and protect himself, revealed the existence of the recording aloud. And just so it's clear, he said, his voice calm but firm, I have been recording this conversation. Every word, every moment. So there's no confusion, no misrepresentation. Everything said here is being documented. The reaction was instantaneous. William's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of shock passing through his controlled demeanor. King Charles blinked, his calm composure momentarily shaken. The revelation transformed the dynamics in the room. What had been a heated confrontation between brothers now became a revelation that threatened to upend the delicate balance of power, trust, and family loyalty within the palace. The air was thick with tension, each second stretching longer than the last. Every heartbeat, every pause, every shifting weight carried the potential to ignite further conflict. The brothers were no longer just navigating their personal grievances. They were navigating the consequences of actions that could ripple far beyond the palace walls. And then came the unspoken question hanging in the room, heavy and electric. What would William do next? Would he attempt to confiscate the recording, confront Harry further, or escalate the confrontation in ways no one could predict? The answer, when it came, would set in motion a chain of events that would redefine not only their relationship, but also the very notion of privacy, loyalty, and trust within the royal family. Harry, despite the shock and emotional weight, remained resolute. He had anticipated confrontation, but he hadn't anticipated the level of strategy, control, and calculation William would bring to bear. And yet, even in the face of this power play, he felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The fear of consequences, the exhilaration of finally asserting his truth, of finally holding a measure of control in a world that had so often stripped it from him. The stage was set for a dramatic fallout, one that would not only expose the fissures between brothers, but also reveal the complex, often hidden dynamics that govern life inside Buckingham Palace. Every decision, every word, every action in the next moments would carry implications that no one could fully anticipate. And just when it seemed the confrontation had reached its peak, William made a move, calculated, deliberate, and shocking. The kind of move that would escalate the situation to levels Harry could not have imagined. And what happened next would change the course of their relationship forever. The weight of the crown is not just a matter of public expectation. It is a burden carried in private moments like this. In the ornate, echoing halls of Buckingham Palace, King Charles found himself trapped in a dilemma that was both personal and profoundly political. His two sons, William, the future king, and Harry, the rebellious prince, stood on opposite ends of a growing chasm, each armed with conviction, emotion, and a deep sense of perceived betrayal. And Charles, for all his years of preparation, found that no handbook could guide him through the storm that was unfolding before his eyes. Charles had always believed in the monarchy as an institution defined by duty, dignity, and tradition. From a young age, he had been trained to embody these principles, to maintain composure in the face of scandal, and to prioritize the continuity of the crown above personal desire. But fatherhood was never so easily codified. Between these two sons lay not just familial affection, but a tangled web of rivalry, resentment, and unmet expectations. And now, with Harry revealing the recording, the very trust that should have bound them together was fractured before his eyes. He looked first at William. The elder son's posture was impeccable, as if carved from stone, but Charles could see the subtle signs of stress: tight shoulders, a faint flush along the jawline, the brief flicker of a hand clenching into a fist. William's authority had always been a combination of inherited power and cultivated discipline. He represented continuity, stability, and a careful guardianship of the royal image. Yet even Charles, seasoned and perceptive, could sense the underlying tension, a mix of anger, fear, and frustration at the younger brother who had repeatedly challenged the rules, the traditions, and the expectations of their family. Then Charles turned to Harry. The younger son's stance was less formal, more defiant, yet tinged with a vulnerability that could not be disguised. Harry's eyes, wide and alert, carried a mix of determination and fear, of resolve and anticipation. He had long struggled with his role within the royal family, wrestling with expectations that often seemed suffocating in a public that rarely understood him. And now, by recording this meeting, Harry had taken control of a narrative that could no longer be contained, potentially turning a private conversation into a weapon of exposure. Charles felt the immense pressure of being the mediator in this charged environment. Every word he might speak carried weight, capable of calming the storm or inflaming it further. And yet, his own feelings were conflicted. As a father, he wanted to protect both of his sons, to maintain the fragile bonds of love and trust. As a king, he needed to uphold the dignity of the monarchy, to ensure that personal disputes did not spill into public scandal. The tension between these two roles was suffocating, a constant tug-of-war that left him weary and uncertain. "Gentlemen," Charles began, his voice carefully measured, "I understand that this situation is tense, but we must remember why we are here. We are a family, yes, but we also have responsibilities that go beyond our personal feelings. Harry, you have taken a serious step by recording this meeting. William, your response to this must be measured." The room was silent for a moment, each man absorbing the weight of the king's words. The chandeliers above seemed to glow with a cold, artificial light, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Every tick of the antique clock on the mantel seemed amplified, marking time that neither Harry nor William could escape. Harry spoke first, his voice steady but edged with emotion. "Father, I did this because I felt I had no other choice. Every time I have tried to speak openly, to share my perspective, it has been misrepresented. I cannot allow another misunderstanding to define me or our family. This recording is my safeguard, my attempt to ensure clarity and honesty." Charles felt a pang of recognition. He understood Harry's motivations. He had long suspected that the younger son felt constrained, scrutinized, and judged unfairly. Yet the act of recording, particularly without prior consent, was unprecedented and potentially explosive. William's response was sharp, controlled, and deliberate. "Father, you know why this is unacceptable. Private conversations within this family are sacrosanct. Harry's actions undermine trust, not only between brothers, but also within the monarchy itself. We cannot allow personal grievances to threaten our public image or our responsibilities as members of the royal family." Charles took a deep breath, his mind racing. The room was a crucible of emotion and power, each statement layered with subtext and potential consequence. He could see the frustration in William's eyes, the defensiveness in Harry's, and the subtle weariness in his own reflection in the polished surfaces around him. Every move, every word, every hesitation mattered. He realized that his role was no longer just to mediate. He needed to navigate a minefield of loyalty, emotion, and perception. One wrong word could escalate tension. One misstep could fracture the fragile trust that still remained. One misjudgment could send ripples through the monarchy and the media alike. "Harry," Charles said finally, his voice firm but gentle, "I understand your need for clarity and protection. But we must find a way to resolve this without causing irreparable harm. The monarchy is bigger than any one of us, and our family must act as a united front. Harry's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of doubt passing through them. He wanted to trust his father, wanted to believe that the king understood the pressures and constraints that he faced. Yet the very act of asserting this recording, a transparent measure meant to safeguard truth, had already created a wedge that felt impossible to bridge. William shifted slightly, his posture tense but controlled. "Father, we need to address the immediate issue. Harry's presence here with this recording is a direct challenge. It threatens our ability to act as a family and as representatives of the crown. I don't know if a conversation alone can resolve this." Charles felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He was caught between two powerful forces: his eldest son, representing tradition, authority, and responsibility, and his youngest, representing truth, transparency, and personal conviction. Each had valid points, each had passionate emotion, each was unwilling to concede easily. And the clock was ticking. Time was a luxury they did not have. He thought about the consequences. If he sided too strongly with William, he risked alienating Harry, deepening a rift that had already been years in the making. If he appeared to condone Harry's actions, he risked undermining William's authority and the stability of the monarchy. The balance was delicate, precarious, and fraught with potential disaster. "Gentlemen," Charles said, his voice steadying, "I propose that we take a step back. We must consider not only our personal feelings, but also the broader implications of our actions. Harry, William, this is not just about you. It's about our family, our duty, and our legacy." Harry exhaled sharply, the tension in his shoulders momentarily easing. He recognized his father's attempt at mediation, even as he bristled at the idea of compromise. William, too, seemed momentarily restrained, though the fire in his eyes had not diminished. And yet, even as Charles sought to impose calm, he sensed that the storm was far from over. The revelation of the recording, the confrontation between his sons, the clash of authority and autonomy. It was a tinderbox waiting for a spark, and that spark was closer than anyone realized. Because in the shadows of the palace, where tradition and secrecy intertwined, decisions were being made, alliances were forming, and plans were being set into motion that could change the royal family forever. And Charles, despite his wisdom and experience, could only hope that his attempts at diplomacy would be enough to prevent a breach that might be impossible to repair. The question loomed in the air, heavy and unspoken. How far would each son go to assert their truth? And what would Charles do when forced to choose, or when the choice was made for him? The tension was palpable, the stakes unimaginable, and the next move would not just determine the outcome of this meeting. It would determine the future of the family itself. The room was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that makes even the grandest walls of Buckingham Palace feel confining. The chandeliers, normally symbols of elegance and tradition, now cast sharp shadows across the polished floors, mirroring the fractures within the royal family. Charles had spoken words of mediation, but now silence had taken on a voice of its own, one that seemed to demand accountability, confrontation, and truth. Harry, still holding the recording device discreetly in his pocket, felt the weight of every second. He hadn't just brought a recorder for protection. He had brought it to expose what he believed had been hidden from him and the public for too long. This was more than a conversation. It was a revelation waiting to happen, and he knew that what he was about to play, or reveal, could ignite a firestorm. "Father, William," Harry began cautiously, "I think it's time you both hear exactly what's been said behind closed doors. Not just to me, but in moments that shaped decisions, conversations I was never meant to hear. Decisions that affect not just me, but the future of this family." Charles's heart sank. He had anticipated a confrontation, yes, but the prospect of Harry exposing internal conversations, private exchanges meant to be protected by trust, was something he hadn't prepared for. He glanced at William. The elder prince's face had tightened, jaw clenched, a flicker of alarm crossing his otherwise composed expression. "What are you talking about, Harry?" William asked, though his voice betrayed more curiosity than accusation. "You can't just—" But Harry didn't let him finish. He placed a hand on the ornate table between them and pressed a button on the device. The first faint hum of the recording filled the room, subtle but unmistakable. Charles winced slightly. He knew the sound was small, but its implications were enormous. The recording started with voices that were unmistakably those of the king and William, discussing matters that had been carefully guarded for months. Charles heard his own words, measured and deliberate, speaking of plans, expectations, and responsibilities, but also of doubts, fears, and frustrations that had never reached the public eye. He had thought these words private, safe within the walls of Buckingham. William's voice, firm but tense, spoke of the younger brother. Harry has been unpredictable. We have tried to accommodate, to guide, but his actions are increasingly erratic. We can't continue like this. It's destabilizing not just the family, but the monarchy itself. The words struck Harry like a physical blow. He had suspected criticism, yes, but hearing it framed in such formal terms, so calculatedly, was shocking. It confirmed a sense of exclusion and judgment that had haunted him for years. "Do you hear that, father?" Harry's voice trembled slightly. "He's speaking about me like I'm some threat, like I'm a problem to be managed. That's not just unfair, it's dehumanizing." Charles felt a pang of guilt and unease. He had always tried to mediate between his sons, to ensure that William's authority and Harry's individuality could coexist. Yet these recorded words were undeniable evidence of the fracture he had long feared. And now, they were out in the open, ready to reshape perceptions in ways that no private conversation should ever have done. The recording continued, revealing exchanges that were even more startling. Plans were discussed, plans about controlling narratives, managing public perception, and even limiting Harry's involvement in certain family events. Charles heard William's voice strategizing, his tone calculated, as if the younger son's every move was a variable to be controlled. Harry's hands shook slightly. He had imagined confrontation, yes, but the reality of hearing these words aloud, knowing that they captured moments he had been excluded from, ignited a storm of emotions, betrayal, anger, and a deep sadness. The room seemed to shrink around him. Charles, ever the mediator, knew he had to act carefully. "Harry, please understand. Some of these conversations were about responsibility and duty. They were never meant to diminish you personally." Harry shook his head, defiance flashing. "But that's exactly what it feels like, father. All my life, I've been made to feel like an outsider. And now, even in these private moments, I hear it again. I'm not just a brother. They're talking about me like I'm a problem to be solved." William's response was measured but sharp, a mixture of frustration and incredulity. "Harry, you need to understand that the monarchy has rules, expectations, and traditions. It's not personal, it's about the institution. The public image, the responsibilities. Everything we do is magnified. Your actions, your choices, they ripple outward in ways you might not fully grasp." The room felt electric, every word crackling with tension. Charles realized that this conversation, once private, had now become a battlefield, and the stakes were higher than ever. Harry leaned forward, intensity in his eyes. "Do you think I don't understand? Do you think I haven't seen the scrutiny, the media pressure, the public speculation? I've lived it my whole life. And yet, they still speak about me as if I'm not capable of understanding, as if my perspective doesn't matter. That's why this recording exists. So everyone can see, hear, and finally understand." The recording had shifted the power dynamic in the room. Where once William's authority had been unquestioned, now Harry held undeniable evidence of candid, unguarded discussions. Charles felt the tension between his sons escalate. The unspoken battle lines were drawn, and there was no clear way to de-escalate without risking further fracture. William's eyes narrowed, voice tight but controlled. "Harry, you may have a right to your feelings, but the method you chose, recording this conversation, is unacceptable. It undermines trust, not just between us, but within the monarchy itself. You've crossed a line." Harry's jaw tightened, a storm of emotion contained behind measured breaths. "Maybe the line was already crossed long before I hit record. Maybe it's been crossed the moment I felt unheard, unseen, and excluded from decisions that affect my life and the family I love." Charles felt the weight of history pressing down on him. The palace, the crown, the legacy, all of it now intertwined with a personal confrontation that could reshape the narrative of the royal family forever. He knew that the ripple effects of this moment would extend far beyond these walls, touching the public, the media, and the monarchy's carefully cultivated image. He also knew that the revelations in this recording would force each of them to confront uncomfortable truths. William would have to reconcile his perception of duty and authority with the real human impact of his words. Harry would have to grapple with the consequences of exposing private conversations. And Charles would have to navigate the aftermath, balancing fatherhood with kingship in a way that could determine the family's unity or its unraveling. As the last faint hum of the recording faded, an almost tangible silence fell over the room. It was the kind of silence that demands reflection, that forces confrontation, that signals a turning point. Each man, caught in his own thoughts and emotions, knew that nothing would ever be the same again. And yet, despite the intensity, a question hung in the air, unspoken but unavoidable. What would happen next? How would William respond to this breach? How would Harry leverage the revelation he had uncovered? And how would Charles reconcile his role as king with his role as father when the family he had worked so hard to protect now stood on the precipice of public scandal? Because one thing was certain, the recording was not just a piece of evidence, it was a spark. And where it would ignite, only time would reveal. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. The hum of the recording still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, a faint reminder of the revelations that had just been laid bare. William's eyes, usually so controlled and calculated, now blazed with an intensity that seemed almost tangible. Every muscle in his body was taut, each movement precise yet charged with suppressed anger. He had prided himself on being the stabilizing force within the family, the one who upheld tradition, order, and the careful balance of royal decorum. But in that moment, confronted by Harry's defiance and the exposure of private conversations, something inside him snapped. "You've gone too far this time, Harry," William said, his voice steady but sharp enough to slice through the air. It wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration, a line drawn in the opulent floorboards of Buckingham Palace. Recording private conversations, exposing them, it's not just a breach of trust, it's a betrayal. Of me, a father, of this family, of everything we are supposed to represent. Harry, for all his composure, felt a ripple of tension. He had anticipated William's anger, yet the sheer intensity of it, the mix of hurt, indignation, and raw authority, was something else entirely. "William, this isn't betrayal," he said, his voice measured but charged with emotion. "This is truth. I've been silent for too long, and the truth matters. It matters to me, to our family, and eventually, to the public who sees only what they're allowed to see. You've had power over the narrative for years. I'm just reclaiming my voice." William's expression hardened. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. "Your voice? Or your ego? You think this is about fairness, but it's not. It's reckless. You don't get to decide when to break rules, when to expose secrets, when to upend decades of family and tradition for what? For your own sense of vindication." Charles watched, heart heavy, as his elder son's fury spilled into the room like a storm. He had always known that William had a temper, albeit controlled and restrained, but this was different. This was the heat of a man who felt threatened not just as a prince, but as the future king, as a guardian of the monarchy's image and legacy. The conflict was no longer about sibling rivalry. It was about authority, succession, and the very essence of what it meant to be a royal. Harry's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew the stakes, understood the delicate balance of power, yet he couldn't back down. "You don't see it because you've always been the favored son. You've always had your place, your path, your expectations. I've had to carve mine out in defiance, in struggle, in scrutiny. And now, I'm showing the world what I've endured, what has been hidden behind closed doors." William's eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "This isn't about favoritism, Harry. This is about responsibility, about loyalty, about the fact that the monarchy depends on discipline and discretion. You're tearing apart the very foundation we've built for centuries. You think the world sees truth when they see your defiance. They see chaos. They see a brother undermining his family, his father, and the institution we are sworn to protect." The words hit Charles like a hammer. He had expected confrontation, but hearing William articulate the stakes in such stark, uncompromising terms crystallized the reality of their situation. This wasn't just a family argument. It was a battle over power, perception, and legacy. And the fissures were deep, threatening to split not just the room, but the monarchy itself. Harry shook his head slowly, disbelief and sorrow mingling in his expression. Chaos, he echoed, incredulous. You call this chaos, William? You call standing up for transparency, for honesty, for accountability chaos? I'm trying to mend what's been broken, to expose what's been hidden, not destroy our family. You've had the privilege of walking a path laid out for you, untouched by scrutiny in the ways I've faced it. This isn't rebellion, it's survival. William's jaw tightened. Survival? Or vengeance? There's a difference, Harry, and you're blurring the line. I've watched you, time and time again, act impulsively, speak carelessly, and now, record privately. This is not survival. This is provocation. You're choosing conflict over family. Do you understand the magnitude of that? Charles felt the air grow heavier with each passing second, the room charged with the weight of decades of history, expectation, and unresolved tension. He could see the emotional stakes reflected in his son's eyes, Harry's defiance, William's fury, and he knew that any intervention had to be both immediate and measured, delicate yet firm. William, Harry, Charles interjected, trying to assert calm. We must remember who we are. This is not just about personal feelings. It's about the family, yes, but also about our duty, our responsibilities, and the legacy we leave behind. If we allow anger to dictate our actions, we risk losing more than words or trust. We risk losing each other. William turned toward his father, the fire in his eyes tempered just slightly by the weight of Charles's presence. Father, with all due respect, the damage is already done. Harry has crossed lines that cannot easily be repaired. Trust, once broken, cannot simply be restored by a few words. This isn't about anger, it's about consequence. Harry's hands clenched at his sides. And what about the consequences of silence, William? The consequences of hiding the truth, of pretending everything is fine when it's not? I can't be complicit in that anymore. I won't. The room seemed to vibrate with tension, the kind that makes every heartbeat feel amplified. Charles knew that the confrontation had reached a pivotal moment. Either a path toward reconciliation would emerge, or the rift between his sons would widen irreparably. William, Charles said, his tone measured, yet carrying the weight of authority, you have every right to feel anger. But fury unchecked can destroy what we've built. You must choose. Do you act out of protection or retaliation? Do you seek understanding or victory? William's gaze softened momentarily, revealing the inner conflict that had been simmering beneath his controlled exterior. He knew his father was right in principle, but the emotions running through him, frustration, betrayal, fear for the family's future, were nearly impossible to set aside. Harry took a step closer, the intensity of his own emotions barely contained. I'm not asking for victory, William. I'm asking for recognition, for honesty, for space to be heard. Can you not see that my actions, however confrontational they seem, come from a place of love and frustration? A desire to fix what's broken? William's face remained impassive, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Perhaps, he said slowly, but fixing it doesn't always require exposing private words or breaking trust. Sometimes, it requires patience, dialogue, and a recognition that not all truths are meant for immediate disclosure. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with emotion, history, and the weight of consequence. Charles realized that this confrontation, while painful, was also necessary. A raw, unfiltered moment of reckoning that would define the trajectory of their relationship moving forward. And yet, as the room seemed to hold its breath, a new awareness settled over them all. The battle was far from over. William's fury had been revealed, Harry's defiance made clear, and Charles stood between them, attempting to mediate a fragile truce. But outside these walls, the ramifications of this meeting were waiting to unfold. The media, the public, and even unseen factions within the royal establishment were all poised to react to whatever came next. Because in the shadows, where influence and ambition thrived alongside tradition and duty, decisions made in this room would echo far beyond Buckingham Palace. And neither brother, nor the king, could fully anticipate the consequences that were about to cascade from this confrontation. The question lingered, impossible to ignore. How far would William go to protect the monarchy and his position within it? How far would Harry go to assert his truth? And what would Charles do when forced to navigate the fallout from the storm that had just begun to rage? The events of that fateful meeting didn't stay confined to Buckingham Palace. In a matter of hours, whispers had begun to seep through the gilded corridors, finding their way into hushed conversations in the staff quarters, private clubs, and diplomatic circles. By the next morning, the ripples of tension had become waves, and the waves were already crashing against the palace gates. It started subtly. An aide, worried about the rising friction between the brothers, mentioned in passing that William's demeanor had been unusually cold, almost surgical in its precision. Another staff member noted the unusual silence from Harry, a man typically energetic and engaging, who had retreated into a reflective, almost brooding, quiet. The combination created an atmosphere thick with speculation. By the afternoon, the palace press office received an urgent call from a close royal correspondent. Rumors of a private dispute escalating had begun to circulate online, and social media was already buzzing with half-truths and wild guesses. The story of William confronting Harry over the clandestine recordings had leaked in fragments, carefully curated fragments, but fragments nonetheless. Newsrooms were abuzz, Twitter feeds lit up, and the public, hungry for insight into the family's inner workings, couldn't get enough. Charles, ever aware of the power of perception, realized the stakes had escalated far beyond a private confrontation. The monarchy had always relied on a careful balance between transparency and mystique. But now, the breach, Harry recording his private conversations and William confronting him in a highly charged altercation, posed a dilemma that could not be ignored. Every journalist, every influencer, every palace commentator was now watching, waiting for confirmation, for nuance, for any hint that might provide them with a headline. Inside Buckingham Palace, tension ran high. Meetings that should have been procedural became battlegrounds of loyalty and suspicion. Advisors whispered warnings in corners, concerned that even the slightest misstep could be amplified into an international scandal. "This isn't just sibling rivalry," one senior aide murmured. "This is a seismic shift. If we can't contain it, it will define the monarchy for years to come." The media's reaction was instantaneous. Headlines appeared within minutes. Royal rift erupts. William confronts Harry in palace showdown. Harry records secret conversations with King Charles. Family in turmoil. Monarchy under strain as brothers clash behind closed doors. Each article took liberties with details, amplifying tensions and framing the story with a dramatic flair designed to maximize clicks and engagement. Social media, of course, magnified every angle. Hashtags trended, memes circulated, and video snippets of previous royal events were recontextualized to fit the narrative of a family divided. The public, long invested in the royal saga, debated heatedly. Was Harry justified in recording the conversations? Was William right to confront him with fury? Could Charles mediate without losing authority? Every opinion, every comment, added fuel to a fire that was already roaring. Inside the palace, the human cost became apparent. Staff members walked on eggshells, fearful of saying the wrong thing or inadvertently leaking information. Security protocols were tightened. Meetings were rescheduled, often abruptly, as the household tried to recalibrate in response to the fallout. Even routine ceremonial duties became fraught, as the optics of public appearances were now scrutinized more than ever. Every photograph, every handshake, every fleeting expression could be dissected for meaning. For Harry, the fallout was both validating and isolating. On one hand, the very act of recording had ensured his perspective would reach the public, albeit in fragments. On the other, he felt the weight of scrutiny, the gaze of not just the media but the monarchy itself, pressing down on him. It was one thing to confront his brother in private. It was another to have every word, every gesture, potentially dissected by millions worldwide. William, meanwhile, experienced a mix of vindication and frustration. He had confronted Harry to defend the family's integrity and his father's dignity, but the leak of even partial information made it impossible to control the narrative. Public opinion was fickle. Every headline seemed to twist his motives. painting him alternately as the dutiful protector of tradition or the tyrannical older brother suppressing truth. Charles, caught in the crossfire, felt the delicate balance of his role more acutely than ever. As king, he was expected to maintain unity, to mediate disputes without bias, to uphold the monarchy's reputation. Yet the very institution he had dedicated his life to was now under unprecedented scrutiny. Each decision he made, every statement or silence, was magnified and interpreted through the prism of an already polarized public. Advisors proposed various strategies to contain the damage. Some suggested a public statement reaffirming family unity, carefully worded to project calm and reassurance. Others argued for private mediation between the brothers, emphasizing that any appearance of weakness could be exploited by the press. Social media teams worked around the clock, monitoring trends, ready to respond to misinformation or emerging rumors. Yet despite all efforts, the palace seemed increasingly reactive, struggling to maintain control over a narrative that was already spiraling. Beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace, public speculation became increasingly intense. Analysts debated the implications for succession, for royal protocol, and for the monarchy's future. Some framed Harry as a modernizer challenging outdated traditions. Others portrayed William as the guardian of legacy and stability. Every faction had its theory, every commentator its spin, but few recognized the nuanced personal stakes involved.